I want a renaissance to shine a light, be the change we want, set things right. We've been waiting in the dark for so long.
Hi everyone, I'm Amethyst, and this is the much anticipated episode of Ask an Autistic, What is Autism? Now this is an absolutely massive topic, and I've actually been dreading this video a little bit because how do I do it justice in roughly 10 minutes? But you all have been waiting so patiently, and so I'm just going to go for it. Autism is a pervasive neurological developmental condition that affects about 1% of human beings. To unpack that a little bit, pervasive means that autism affects pretty much every part of a person. Their personality, their experiences, their memories, how they grow up, how they communicate, and how they think and move. Basically, pervasive means that autism isn't something that just affects one part of a person. It's not something extra a person has tacked onto them, and it's also not something small that can be overlooked. Neurological indicates that autism has to do with the brain. Being autistic means that your brain functions differently. The structure of the brain may be different than non-autistic people's brains, and the different areas of the brain and how they talk to each other and work together may be different as well. Developmental indicates that autism begins before birth. When a little fetus is developing, it's either going to be neurotypical or neuroatypical. It's going to be autistic or allistic, and all that is determined very early. So autistic people are born autistic. Autism isn't something that can happen to you. It's not something you can catch, and contrary to what some would have you believe, it's not the result of things like heavy metal poisoning. And autism is not caused by vaccines. This isn't even something I will discuss because it's not a discussion, they just don't. Basically, a lot of people want to point fingers at what causes autism, but the truth is that autism is a naturally occurring variation in the human brain. And there have always been autistic people, it's just that we didn't recognize them as autistic. Autism isn't a disease, it's not something that you can catch or transmit. And it's not an illness. Autism isn't something that you can fix or cure. Autistic people are like people with Down syndrome. We are born autistic, and we'll live our lives autistic. And hopefully, with the help of our family and our friends and our loved ones, we can grow up into happy, healthy autistic people. Many autistic children will follow a different developmental trajectory than non-autistic children. Autistic people tend to do things at our own pace. An autistic child may speak at 3 or 5 or 10, and of course some autistic people will never speak with their mouth parts. But that doesn't mean that they won't hit other milestones or that they're not going to develop. Autistic children have just as much capacity for growth and development and learning as non-autistic children do. It's just that because our brains work differently, because we think differently and we see the world differently, we take in sensory input and process it differently, our brains are different, and so we are going to grow and develop and learn differently. All autistic people are different, but there are some things that all autistic people share in common. Autistic people will often have distinct or atypical ways of processing information. The way we look at the world, perceive it, process what we're seeing, and then think about that information is different than in non-autistic people. Autistic people often have different abilities or capacities for language. Some autistic people report that they don't naturally think in language. They may think in visuals or in abstract feelings or in just not words. And so using words, using spoken or written language, isn't first nature for a lot of autistic people. And so that requires this constant translation because our society is very much based in spoken language. All autistic people will have atypical sensory experiences. Autistic people may be over or undersensitive to sensory input from their environment or within themselves. Some autistic people are both over and undersensitive to sensory input at the same time. Autism also affects the way that a person moves. Many autistic people have motor dyspraxia, which is where the brain knows what it wants to do, but there's a kind of disconnect between the brain and the body. And so this can result in clumsiness or issues with fine motor control. Things like tying your shoelaces or writing by hand. And some autistic people find that they have trouble with gross motor control. Things like riding a bicycle or keeping their balance or kicking a soccer ball. Autistic people also do something called stimming. Stimming is also known as self-stimulation or stereotyped or repetitive behaviors. There are as many different ways to stim as there are autistic people, but some common stims include hand flapping, often when excited or agitated, rocking back and forth or side to side if that's more your thing. A common stim is finger flicking. A lot of people will wring their hands or twirl their hair. Some chewing or biting on clothing or objects is a common stim. And also visually stimming by flicking your fingers in front of your face or using an object. And there are ways to vocally stim as well, like repeating a favorite word or humming or singing. Stimming is one of the most obviously autistic behaviors. And by that I mean, autism is kind of an invisible disability, in that there are no physical markers of autism, and autistic people don't all share physical traits. But when an autistic person starts stimming, starts moving in a way that is naturally autistic or obviously disabled, that invisible disability becomes visible. A lot of autistic people will prevent themselves from stimming or from moving in the way that is most natural and comfortable for them because they don't want to be perceived as weird, and we live in a very ableist society where disability is considered kind of shameful and bad. Some autistic people, ASAN says it's about 2 in 10 autistic people, will never speak with their mouth parts. And by that I mean they may be able to communicate via alternative methods of communication, but they'll never actually speak with their mouth. Of course, this is not the same as not having anything to say. Through use of methods of AAC, like text-to-speech apps, or the rapid prompting method, or pointing to a letterboard or sign language, autistic people who are nonverbal, who can't speak with their mouth, are able to communicate. This allows autistic people who have verbal apraxia, which is like motor dyspraxia, but a disconnect between the brain and the mouth specifically, to advocate for themselves and to talk to people around them and to say what they think and feel and what they want, just to communicate, which really is a basic human right that everybody should have the opportunity to do. Many autistic people will have comorbid conditions in which they're autistic, but they also have another or multiple other mental illnesses or neurological conditions or whatever else going on. I'm autistic and I'm also synesthetic, meaning that I have synesthesia. And I also have OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a mental illness. Autism is a different kind of brain. It's a different kind of brain wiring, but it's also a disability. This is because the autistic neurotype is often accompanied by impairments, like impairments in executive functioning, which is the ability to start a task and then to continue on that task, to keep all the steps straight in your head, and then to follow through and complete the task. And so multi-step processes or tasks can be difficult for autistic people. Some autistic people have trouble communicating with non-autistic people. Due to differences in information and sensory processing, things like tone of voice or sarcasm or sarcastic joking can really throw us off. A lot of autistic people will avoid eye contact for sensory reasons or because it's harder to process information while maintaining eye contact. And a lot of autistic people will have difficulty with facial expressions, which actually have a lot of information in them all at once. And facial expressions and microfacial expressions can change very quickly. And so it can be difficult to keep up while also keeping up with all the other sensory input and information in the environment. Difficulty in communication isn't true in the same ways for all autistic people. Some autistic people will have trouble with eye contact, and some don't. Some autistic people have trouble detecting sarcasm, and others don't. But all autistic people will have some kind of communication or language differences. Motor dyspraxia and issues with fine motor control are also considered an impairment. And sensory integration differences, or sensory processing disorder, can be very debilitating in a society that is very loud and very fast and very bright, and that is built for people with typical sensory experiences and thus doesn't accommodate people with sensory processing disorder or different sensory integration experiences. It's tough being autistic in a world that's built for non-autistic people. But that's what accommodations are for. What accommodations do is level the playing field for people with disabilities. Because when you're disabled, when you have impairments, you don't have the same opportunities as non-disabled people. But accommodations can change that. Accommodations for autistic people can look like providing access to alternative and augmentative methods of communication, or AAC. Accommodation for autistic people can look like being understanding and accepting of the fact that autistic people have different sensory integration and needs than you do. And so being accepting of the ways that autistic people will accommodate their sensory needs, like wearing sunglasses indoors, or wearing ear protection against loud noises, or stimming to deal with negative sensory input. Being accepting of that, of the ways that we cope, and also making an effort to make the environment more friendly to autistic people are great ways to accommodate autistic people. Like people with other kinds of disabilities, autistic people deserve the same rights and opportunities that non-disabled neurotypical people get. Autistic people deserve to access the same level of education and the same employment opportunities as everyone else. No matter what an autistic person's impairments or challenges are, they're going to have strengths as well. Because we're human. We're very complex that way. The thing to do for autistic people is to keep in mind that we're people. The ways that we move and think and communicate and express ourselves are different. They may look different than how you would do those things, but that doesn't mean they're invalid. The autistic way of being, the autistic experience, is not wrong, it's just different. All autistic people deserve the same rights and respect and societal inclusion that non-autistic people do. Whether or not they can pass well as non-autistic, if they seem almost normal to you, whether or not they move or communicate differently than you do, and whether or not they can speak with their mouth parts. Like I've said, every autistic person is different, and autism itself is a very complex condition. So really, in this video, I was just able to scratch the surface, and just that. So if you're interested in learning more about autism, I'm going to link to some awesome resources in the video description, so please do check those out. And I'll also be linking to my blog and my Facebook page and my Twitter, where I tweet and post and blog about all things autism and disability related. I hope you all are having a wonderful, flappy Autism Acceptance Month, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching Ask an Autistic.
I want a renaissance to shine a light, be the change we want, set things right. We've been waiting